Hi there. Welcome back to Bio 23 Infectious Disease, Chapter 17, where we're going to talk about the power of infectious microbes. Mostly, we're going to talk about bioweapons in this chapter. Your book does cover the promise of microbes in talking about genetically modified organisms and CRISPR technology. But since that's out of the scope of this class, we're going to focus on bioweapons because that is infectious disease. Historically, microbes have always played a role in battles. In many cases, microbes weren't intentionally used, but were possibly even more influential than conventional weaponry and human intervention. That's because battlefield conditions are conducive to the spread of infectious diseases due to unsanitary conditions resulting from problems with disposing of human feces, the unavailability of clean drinking water for combat troops, poor personal hygiene, crowding, inadequate supplies of safe food, and overwhelmed and inadequate medical facilities. These living conditions are known to have contributed to another number of battles, including the Battle of Waterloo, in which Napoleon's army was infected by a massive outbreak of typhus as he tried to invade Russia. Almost 1/3 of the soldiers had typhus and died from the disease. In addition, during the American Civil War, diseases such as malaria in the United States, typhoid fever, and dysentery claimed the lives of more U.S. soldiers than were lost in World War I. The circumstances of war forced people to move into overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, such as refugee camps, prisoners of war, and inhabitants of concentration camps. All of this played out in the 2017-2018 cholera outbreak in the war-torn region of Yemen. The World Health Organization, or WHO, estimates that more than 1 million people were infected during this time, with thousands of people dying. Let's talk about the history of biological weaponry. There's a difference between biological warfare, or bioweapons, and biological terrorism. We're going to start off with using biological weaponry. Early in the history of warfare to World War II, we did see some evidence of soldiers and armies using bioweapons. During the siege of Kaffa, which is now Feodosia in Ukraine, in 1346, the Tatar army recognized that plague-ridden corpses could be used as weapons. They were running out of projectiles to load into their catapults, and the corpses that built up around them due to people dying from the plague were starting to accumulate, and the soldiers didn't know what to do. So they in fact solved two problems at once by loading these plague-ridden corpses onto their catapults and flinging them over the city walls into the city of Kaffa. These plague-ridden corpses didn't cause any disease, but the fleas that were found in their clothes did. So it was in fact the fleas that were in the clothes of these corpses that carried the plague and would then come off of the clothes, bite other people in the city of Kaffa, and infect them with the plague. This worked, and the Tatar army were able to claim victory in the city of Kaffa. The people of the city of Kaffa ended up fleeing, and in many cases fled west into other parts of Europe. It is speculated that this is what may have led to the development and appearance of the Black Death during the medieval ages in Europe at the time. During a plague outbreak, bodies of dead soldiers were hurled into the ranks of the enemy in Karlstein, Bohemia in 1422. And again, in 1710, Russian troops battling Swedish forces in Reval, now in modern-day Estonia, threw their plague victims over city walls. This was a very effective measure, and the only reason why it stopped was because cities stopped having city walls. It was a lot more difficult then to separate the plague-ridden corpses from the soldiers' troops themselves. In other cases, in addition to the plague, other diseases were used. This included smallpox. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors may have given smallpox-contaminated clothing to South American natives to intentionally infect them with this very deadly disease. Smallpox was completely unknown in the Americas, and so every person in the Americas, all the native populations, were susceptible to this virus. Europeans, on the other hand, who had grown up with this disease, had resistance in their adult populations. So a Spanish adult likely would have already had smallpox and developed resistance to it, whereas native populations in the Americas, those adults had never had smallpox and thus were susceptible and could be killed. There are document reports that the same thing happened in North America, with British colonial soldiers handing out blankets from smallpox hospitals to local Delaware tribes in order to also transmit disease to them. During World War I, Germany was accused of conducting biological warfare by shipping infected horses and cattle to the United States and other countries. It was also alleged, but never proven, that in 1915, German forces attempted to spread cholera into Italy and Russia, and airdropped bacterial-contaminated fruit, chocolate, and children's toys into Romania. It wasn't until World War II that bioweapons really began to be developed, and evidence of their use was put into modern record. Japan used biological warfare agents in Manchuria, China, from 1932 until the end of World War II. The infamous Japanese Army Units 731 and 100 were biological warfare units that conducted horrible, inhumane, and torturous experiments on prisoners of war from China. These prisoners were injected with pathogens, including anthrax-causing Bacillus anthracis, meningitis-causing Neisseria meningitidis, cholera-causing Vibrio cholerae, and Shigella, which causes shigellosis. Finally, Yersinia pestis as well, which caused bubonic plague. As a result, at least 3,000 prisoners died from these horrible diseases. Reports also suggest that in at least 11 Chinese cities, the Japanese contaminated water and food supplies with a variety of pathogens, threw live cultures of these bacteria into homes, or sprayed infective aerosols from aircrafts. Japan is also known to have attacked Chengte in 1941 using Vibrio cholerae. This backfired, however, resulting in 1,700 deaths among Japanese troops, illustrating one of the common dangers of using bioweapons, that they could end up infecting your own military. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, is known to have considered anthrax as a retaliatory measure if Germany had used bioweapons against Britain. In fact, the United Kingdom was known to have generated anthrax bombs and tested them in various locations. None to actively be used in World War II. In response to the international threat of the use of bioweapons, the United States also embarked on an offensive biological weapons program in 1942. The Soviet Union also began a program in World War II. The U.S. initiative was headquartered at Camp Detrick, later renamed Fort Detrick, in western Maryland. At its peak in 1945, almost 2,000 scientific and military personnel worked at this maximum security campus, which at the time housed the world's most advanced biological warfare unit. The military, working out of Fort Detrick, ended up testing some of their bioweapons techniques on US cities, including New York and San Francisco. They did not use infectious microbes, but rather harmless microbes to see how far and wide they could spread. It was then understood through these experiments that these bioweapons could spread quite rapidly and quite easily using public transit and aerosolized mechanisms. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 was eventually convened and a treaty was signed by 103 nations in order to prohibit the development of delivery systems intended to dispense biological agents and destroy the stocks of biological agents that have already been developed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and others. In addition, they were to destroy delivery systems and all equipment within 9 months of signing. However, it became evident within the next few decades that though some nations signed to this treaty, not all of them complied. That brings us to 1972 until September 11, 2001. The biological arsenal at Fort Detrick was destroyed, and Fort Detrick became focused primarily on defending against bioweapons rather than offensive anthrax bombs. The Fort Detrick biological arsenal included not only anthrax, but also tularemia and Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and also components isolated from living systems, including botulinum toxin, staphylococcal enterotoxin B, and other biological agents that target crops. The Soviet Union, however, continued an offensive biological weapons program, generating anthrax in order to stuff into additional anthrax bombs, at least through the 1980s. We know this to be true because on April 2nd, 1979, inhabitants of a community known as Sverdlovsk, which is now known as Ekaterinburg, downwind of a Soviet military microbial facility, reported many hospitals that had patients with symptoms of anthrax. At least 94 cases and 64 autopsy-confirmed deaths resulted. This was the largest epidemic of inhalational anthrax in history. And the only way that this could have happened was through the production of anthrax as a bioweapon, because anthrax is almost always transmitted through soil or contact with an animal, resulting in cutaneous anthrax, not inhalational anthrax. It was later confirmed by Boris Yeltsin that this is in fact what happened, that an offensive biological weapons program had a failure to activate air filters as part of their building safety measures and resulted in the accidental release of the anthrax endospores. In the next section, we're going to talk about the development of bioterrorism, not bioweapons used by governmental organizations.